Welcome. I am Daisy, your hostess. In this video, we continue with the book titled Telepathy and Thought-Transference by Professor S.A. Weltmer. He has suggested that there is an interchange of thought between the soul of man and God, and also between thoughts of one soul with another. I believe from my personal experience that there is something to be said about telepathy. And I will add that even the United States government has put money behind conducting studies on this so-called paranormal field, and it is evident in the now declassified documents of the CIA program known as the Gateway Process. If you are interested, I have a video that goes more into detail. I will leave the link in the description of this video. I would not be surprised that more often than not, many people are engaged in telepathic communication unconsciously, and that there are a few that have been able to augment the use of this extra sense where it seems to them as natural as any of the physical senses. I've learned that when it comes to extra senses, we all have them, and it's like any one of our physical senses. The more we consciously and actively are aware of how we are using it, the more it becomes natural. Like, for example, take the physical sense of hearing. We go all day hearing a plethora of things. Some people have more keen hearing than others, right? Yet, we have become so familiar with the sounds of what we hear that we naturally tune things out. Yet, we can be in a crowd and any one person can shout out our name and we keenly perk up. I'm not an expert in this field, but I feel that, and I'm quite confident that it's no different. If you have had any telepathic experiences, leave a comment. I believe that sharing our experiences brings us closer in understanding how normal this is. Coming back to these next few chapters, the author will discuss how thought transference has influenced the minds of men and women to inspire great works of art, music, feats of engineering, and more. He will also dive into remote healing. While the concept of remote healing, also known as distance healing, is often viewed with skepticism, some scientific research suggests it may have measurable effects, particularly on psychological well-being. Studies on distant healing intention therapies, where a person's focused intention is used to affect another at a distance, have shown that it can have a small but statistically significant impact on physiological states and behaviors. In an article found in National Library of Medicine titled Distant Healing Intention Therapies, an overview of the scientific evidence, they say that despite the challenging assumptions underlying the concept of distant healing intention, its practice is widespread. And I'm going to quote directly from the article. It is well accepted evidence for quantum non-locality, which demonstrates the existence of spooky action at a distance, as Einstein described it, and the growing evidence for quantum coherence effects in living systems, making distant healing no longer inconceivable. End quote. I've left the link of this article in the description as well. I'd like to take a minute and mention spooky action at a distance, as the article mentioned is a term coined by Albert Einstein to describe quantum entanglement, which is a phenomena where two particles become linked, and measuring the state of one instantly determines the state of the other, regardless of the distance between them. This concept initially troubled Einstein because it seemed to violate the principle that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, which is a cornerstone of his theory of relativity. And one thing I've learned is that just because science of today cannot explain something because our present knowledge of it is an enigma or a mystery, we still haven't developed evidence and tools and technology, whatever, it by no means should be interpreted that the enigma or the mystery doesn't exist. The beauty is in the realm of possibilities and our ability to be flexible and curious and to say, hey, we knew what we knew then and we know what we know now and we're ready to explore further. Before we turn the page and meet up with the author, Professor Weltmer, which I think he's already ready for us, I'd like to share one more thing. Perhaps you've heard of Gregg Braden, I added one of his first books to my library over 30 years ago. He is a former senior aerospace computer systems designer and proposes the existence of an intelligent field of energy, which he calls the divine matrix, and he suggests that it connects everything in the universe. This field, he says, responds to our thoughts, emotions, and beliefs, implying they can influence physical reality, including healing. I believe that recently, due to technology advancements, we are now exploring telepathy because of that. And we're exploring it not as a paranormal activity, but more as an inquiry that there is an interaction with the mind of man and the field around us. And some call it God. And with that, let's turn the page. Chapter 8. Telepathy and Thought-Transference in the World of Invention. Cicero, in addressing the Roman Senate, said to Julius Caesar concerning his pardon of Marcellus, "To have conquered yourself is a deed which raises you above humanity and makes you most like God. Self-mastery is the victory which overcometh the world." Cicero spoke well. The only weakness in his statement is in that self-mastery raises one above humanity. It is the germ thought of my philosophy that humanity itself shall acquire this mastery, that humanity as a whole shall be raised to that plane which is godlike, into that atmosphere where God dwells, not in the lower strata of self. Men rush hither and thither, and life, to most, is a zigzag movement whose ultimate is undefined. Not because this was the Master's plan concerning individual life or concerning humanity at large, but man has failed to listen to the voice of his inner consciousness where God speaks. The law of life is the law of obedience to that divine impulse which is unerring and which is never wanting in any human soul. When man puts his own hand to the helm and becomes the pilot of his own craft, he neither hears God's voice in the thunders of the stormy winds, in the tumbling waves, nor yet in the calm sea. Yet the feet of the Master are upon the waves. His voice is in the lightnings. His hand is upon the helm, if only so man wills. It is this evolution of the inner consciousness which is essential to the race. The race is the aggregate of individuals. The individual is the basal in all structures. The individual is that which his inner consciousness determines. His outer self is an expression of the inner. Froude says of Cicero, concerning his treachery to Caesar, "Our characters are written in our forms, and the bust of Cicero is the key to his history. Who that has looked upon the mobile marble features of Cicero, but has read therein the fawning sycophant and the treacherous knave?" The nobleman who, in addressing the Roman Senate, could say in the presence of Julius Caesar, with motive dark as deadly weapons, "His person is sacred, and to injure him by word or deed shall be counted sacrilege." And again, while the body of the dead Caesar lay upon the floor of the Senate, let us draw a veil over all that has been done, not looking too curiously into the acts of anyone. In Cicero, we have the expression of one mighty in his possibilities, but that might diverted to personal ends at the expense of all that was sacred. Had Cicero listened to the voice of the infinite speaking ever within the soul, it could never have been written of him that he so perverted his high powers. No man ever walked on the low plane of animal passion who sat at meat with the Master in the upper chamber of his own soul. The voice of that Master Spirit within calms the passions of the outer man. Discord creeps away into the silence. The harmony of the divine nature infuses itself into the human, and under this transfusion of power, life finds its highest expression. Man's destiny lies in his capacity to listen to the still small voice, which never carries a minor tone. A lady, one of sweet and gifted nature, whose very presence is harmony, said to me recently, "To discover the real things of life, one must listen to the vibration of the soul's atmosphere. We are too material. In the stress of life, we rush hither and thither. If we waited in the silence until we knew the direction, we would not only conserve our energies by the directness of the movement, but we would avoid the friction which comes of the attrition of things. In the training of my pupils in voice culture, I developed the quality and compass of tones by first taking my pupils into the thought realm. I teach them the language of vibration, both in the lower and in the higher tones. I lead them gradually to a mental conception of the higher vibrations. Then I bid them construct into forms these vibrations, to give them color, to give them quality. After they have formed these mental conception, I assure them they can reach these higher notes, and so the voice capacity lies less in the so-called vocal cords, more in the mental realm. It is because vocal culture has largely been limited to the vocal organism rather than the mentality that we have so many trained voices, so few singers. That quality, that sweetness which is the expression of the soul, comes from the soul's perception of harmony, comes from listening to the universal orchestra of God's universe. It is that harmony which the soul perceives in the birdsong, in the soughing of the winds, in the falling of the leaf, in the breath of the pines, in the perfume of the rose, blended into one tone, and in that tone is the whisper of the infinite. This teacher is an artist. She has received her message from him in whose voice is the full melody. Under the law of thought-transference, all minds may harmonize who think on the same plane. Man chooses the plane on which he thinks, hence the plane of harmony or discord is his own. One of the most pathetic incidents in the dark struggle of our Civil War teaches this law of vibration. A division each of the Northern and Southern Army were encamped near each other. The campfires of each were visible to the other, and as they lit up the gloom of the night, shadows they served to ignite the passion for victory in each, which meant to each the slaying of the other. In fact, they were so near that the movements of each seemed to awaken the bitterness of the strife, and so for a long time each army was a discord to the other. When the band of either division played, it was a pain to the other. At last, on the still, silent air of a summer evening, within one camp broke forth the notes of that world-embracing melody, "Home, Sweet Home." Clearer and clearer grew the tones, more and more silent grew the hearts of men. The vibrations of that melody swept across the limitations of the encampment, broke in upon the atmosphere of the other camp, and softened the hearts of men. The other band instantly tuned its instruments to "Home, Sweet Home." In a few moments they adjusted themselves to the time of the other band, and the two opposing armies played together that one divine melody, which is the harmony in the soul of every wanderer. As the tones floated out upon the evening air, the discord in the hearts of the soldiers ceased. For a little time there was silence, and then both armies, as by the power of one supernal impulse, broke forth into one wild song of "Home, Sweet Home," and there was no more discord.
Pleasures and palaces, though we may roam, be it ever so humble, there's no place like home.
The two armies had met on that high plane on which they could vibrate together. The passion of strife was forgotten. Into each heart had come the voice of peace, the voice of him who said unto the world, My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Such is the power of a telepathic message by thought transference transfused into the minds of the multitudes. Turning to another phase of this limitless subject, we discover in the inventions of the world, in their inception, in their evolution, in their final consummation, the united voice of these two messengers of God and man. As among the earlier of American inventors, we turn to the experience of Franklin and Morse. Franklin harnessed the lightning. He gave to Morse the identity of electricity by thought transference. Morse made electricity the servant of mankind by the individuality of his own effort. Thought transference looks upon the deeds of men and says, "What great things men have done." Telepathy says, "What others have done I can do." This was the voice of omnipotence, voice ever audible to human ears, but first interpreted to men by Jesus Christ. Christ received the telepathic message from the Father. He interpreted that message in reference to human effort in the following words: "Whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And neither the winds nor the floods which beat upon the house could overthrow it." 17 centuries later, a barbarian schoolmaster interpreted the same message in these words: "Things that have to be done must be learned by doing them." Jesus said to his disciples, "He that believeth on me, the works that I shall do, he do also, and greater works than these shall he do." From the book of John, chapter 14, verse 12. The clergy for 19 centuries have thundered from every pulpit that the things Christ could do, no man could do, and to attempt it were blasphemy. Christ's methods of healing were lost in the theology of the early church, the church affirming that they were miracles and only Christ could perform miracles. Thus, the essential element of the Christ philosophy was lost. Things that have to be done must be learned by doing them. Every hammer, chisel, saw, plow, scythe, reaper, wagon, carriage, railroad tie, in fact, every successful human achievement has proven that Jesus was right. Even the hammer has done as much to illustrate the teachings of Christ as the preachings from the pulpit. A brief resume of the experiences of S.F.B. Morse, the inventor of the telegraphic alphabet, will illustrate our theme. The appropriation bill of $30,000 to build a telegraphic line from Washington to Baltimore had, after a great struggle, passed the House by a majority of 8 votes, 82 votes being cast against it. March 3, 1843, dawned upon the fluctuating hopes of Morse. The bill still hung fire in the Senate. It was the last night before adjournment of the session. Morse listened to the debate as if the destiny of his soul were in the balance. He left the Senate at a late hour, unable longer to bear the tension. Without knowing the fate of the bill, his secretary, a young lady of high character, remained and had the pleasure of seeing the bill passed in the final hour of adjournment. She hastened to his hotel and announced the fact to Mr. Morse. When, therefore, the line to Baltimore was ready for the transmission of a message, Morse gave his secretary the privilege of writing the message. She quoted the words from the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 23. "What hath God wrought?" Herein is the recognition of the inspiration of the divine thought and its adoption in the mind of men. But cooperation was needed. That cooperation must be secured through thought transference. Thought forces may be by sudden evolution or as the seed in the barren soil of slow growth. The history of all scientific progress in the history of the antagonisms of mind's unreceptive thought. The struggles of Morse are painful history, but such was his devotion to the spirit of the message within his soul that he counted not himself. 4 years prior to that Senate triumph, he had, according to biographers, oft times to borrow money for his meals and was not infrequently 24 hours without food. Under the inspiration of that first message, what hath God wrought? The vibration of its power touched the heart of the world. Within 8 years, the monarchs of all Europe had decorated him. At the instance of Napoleon III, representatives of France, Austria, Sweden, Russia, Sardinia, the Netherlands, Turkey, Holland, the Papal States, and Tuscany met in Paris in August 1858 to decide upon a collective testimonial to Morse, and the result of their deliberations was a vote of 400,000 francs. In June 1871, when a telegraphic communication had been established on the continents of the world, a bronze statue of Morse was erected in Central Park, New York. In the record of the ceremonies, it is noted the following message was sent over all the wires of the United States, they having been on this occasion all put in connection with the wire at New York. Greetings and thanks to the telegraphic fraternity throughout the land. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill to men. In this message is the perhaps unconscious recognition of the telepathic communication from the divine mind to the human, which received and constructed it, form by Morse, brought goodwill to men. Morse simply sent his own name across the wires. This being done, the chairman of the hour said, "Thus the father of the telegraph bids farewell to his children." It has been well said of Franklin and Morse, relatively, the one conducted the lightning safely from the sky, the other conducted it beneath the ocean, from continent to continent. The one tamed the lightning, the other made it minister to human wants and human progress. It was fitting that the last public act of Morse should be the unveiling of a statue to Franklin. A kindred experience is had in the invention of the cotton gin by Mr. Eli Whitney. This invention was the first master stroke toward the dissolution of the system of American slavery. It increased the product of labor in the preparation of cotton for the markets from 1 to 5 pounds per day by manual effort of the Negro to 1,000 pounds by the cotton gin. Hence, it increased the necessity for the employment of a great force of Negroes in the cotton-growing states, and shifted the institution of slavery southward. According to the statistics, the cotton gin had increased the exports of the South, within 10 years, from 200,000 in the first to 42 million pounds in the 10th year. Yet the struggles of Mr. Whitney to win recognition were scarcely less marked than those of Mr. Morse. But the idea of the cotton gin was not born with Mr. Whitney, but rather in the mind of a widow lady, Mrs. Nathaniel Greene, wife of General Greene, who, in noting the excessive amount of labor involved, began the mental study of a possibility of the separation of the lint from the cotton seed by machinery. Mrs. Greene's message was telepathic, Mr. Whitney's thought-transference. Elias Hell, inventor of the sewing machine, the inventor of the sewing machine received into his soul the message of relief for working women by means of a sewing machine. For 5 years, after his studies in the shop were completed, he worked upon the project. Such was the opposition in conservative New England to machinery, which would throw out of employment any member of the laboring classes, that, although patented, the machine received no recognition in America. Howe then went to England. After 2 years' unsuccessful effort, he returned to this country utterly destitute, working his way home as a common sailor. In 1867, his royalty had amounted to millions. Cyrus W. Field, founder of the Atlantic Cable, received his message of power direct from the infinite mind. Its expression is found in the statement of Christ, "I will draw all men unto me." How else then by the cable should the interchange of continental thought and the momentum of continental movements be sustained and interpreted to the race? Moreover, the constantly increasing activity in the religious as well as commercial world, the stationing of the representatives of the church in the interior and the representative of governments in the ports of foreign lands, made their safety dependent upon more rapid interchange. Yet so obtuse was the public mind that Field was 13 years in developing the enterprise. It is said of him that he crossed and recrossed the seas almost constantly for 20 years, there being no other interchange between England and America. The first cable was laid and the first message interchanged between the two countries but a short time prior to the Civil War. The war absorbed American energy and American capital to the extent that all inventive enterprise was in suspension. Soon after its close, the Great Eastern, of which every schoolboy knows, was built and fitted out of the transmission of the new cable. 1,200 miles at sea, the cable parted and the vessel returned to England. About the middle of the next year, the final cable was laid, and today continent speaks with continent, as individual with individual by telegraphic channels. In these illustrations, one perceives the marvelous momentum of thought interchange gained in the past half-century. Who that detects these movements can be persuaded of the eternal facts so late perceived by mankind, of a thought atmosphere in which man is enveloped and in which vibrates the accumulated thought of the ages, and that out of that accumulation, and man's increased receptivity thereto, has come the tremendous progress of the race which has marked the past century. Herein also is demonstrated the sequence of this fact, man's power to draw from this atmosphere the conception of invention, of scientific truth, of a religious order of thought, divested of the errors of the ages. Error dies and is buried in the sepulchre of the ages. It may be slow dying, but death comes at last, and the sepulchre is for all time. The skeleton is never exhumed by the hands of time, and if exhumed, would only be as the loathsome carcass in the eyes of men. How glorious, then, is life at the present hour to him who lives! Animal existence has in it no element of power. The wild beasts of the forest exist. He browses among the brambles. He is torn in the jungles. He has his dwelling place with the adverse winds. Life is man's, except he chooses the solitude and the miasm. But today the track of the forest is no longer a peril, for the sound of the saw and the hammer are making a highway for the feet of progress, and the chariot of the Lord passes this way undisturbed. Invention has builded the chariot wheels, and the voice of the Omnipotence speaketh from within. A highway is prepared for the ransom of the Lord. The ransomed are they who hear his voice, who execute his message, who transfuse that message into the thought of men. And these are they who build our steamships, who construct the mighty enginery of mechanics, who place in the hands of the toiler that instrument which enables him to lift his hands from the soil and turn them toward the heaven. The noise of these chariot wheels is as the song of the morning, and he who turns his eyes toward the eastern horizon may in the gray dawn perceive the form of him who cometh in the clouds with power and great glory. Blessed is he who shall live to see the high noon of that glory, when all men shall know the Lord, shall know him in the equality of men, in the dignity and power of individualism, in the unification of the races, unification which is not a dream of the night to be enforced at the point of the bayonet, but a unification of soul. And in that soul, consciousness shall be discovered a resident system of telepathy. The universality of mind shall be understood. The omnipotence of mind shall be comprehended. The omnipotence of man shall be relatively as the omnipotence of God, and the wisdom of man in his need as the omniscience of him who has flooded the mental atmosphere with his own exhaustless thought. This high noon of the world comes sooner than we think. Even while we write, the dawn melts away into the morning hours, and the watchman no longer inquires, "What of the night?" For night cometh not again, and it is already the third hour of the day. Returning to thought forms of individual minds, we find nothing is complex. That which seems subtle is susceptible to analysis after thought formulas. When the forces of the thought world are projected into the material, the mind of man discovers material form. That form is visible to the mental eye before it becomes visible to the external eye. Out of this fact are born the laws of architecture, of art, of sculpture, of mechanical arts. There is first visible to the inner consciousness the thought form of the cathedral, the palace, the statue. In the city of Chicago stands a magnificent structure known as the Temple. It was the project of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union by the power of that mighty spirit of the organization. Matilda B. Carse. To her own inner consciousness there came a message, a purpose, the establishment of headquarters for this great organization, which should be a perpetual monument of its activities. As it stands today, there is a large auditorium on the first floor called Willard Hall, where noonday service is always held for the benefit of those who pass to and from their places of toil. Here, too, are often heard the voices of the great speakers of this and other lands. Within the structure are the headquarters of the publishing company of that organization, the editorial quarters of the Union Signal, and various other periodicals issued by the organization, a restaurant of high order, and multitudes of offices connected by a series of elevators. In a word, the entire building is modern in all of its departments. Mrs. Carse conceived this entire structure, unaided by suggestions from any external source, and was able to give to the architect the design with such minutiae of detail that he had but to apply the rules in mathematical formula, and the whole structure was placed upon canvas. More than this, the financial scheme was her own, and a very large proportion of the money was contributed under the inspiration of her voice in public assemblies. She was able, moreover, by the inspiration of her genius, to secure the interest of the shrewdest capitalists in the purchase of bonds. The temple stands today, the material expression of a telepathic message to a single mind, that mind transfusing that message into the thought of those who became its supporters, both in this and other lands. The same law of receptivity and of transmission is revealed in every statue which graces the art centers of the world. The American sculptor Hiram Powers expressed in marble such a conception of liberty enchained as has awakened in the thought of men the irrepressible passion of freedom for the humblest of the race. His Greek slave stands chained in the marketplace, but the voice of liberty is heard in every delicate curve of the pulsing marble. The musician who holds a world entranced is he who has gathered into his own soul the divine symphonies and transposes them to men. Paganini, at 10 years of age, would awaken from the strings of his violin melodies which charmed the European courts. A little later in life, he was able to enact that miracle of effort which is yet uninterpreted to the casual ear, to render an entire piece of music on a single string. But Paganini had learned the secret of gathering into one tone the octave of universal melody. Hence he needed but one wire for its expression to the receptive ear. To the untrained, it was still needful to brush all the strings. The orator whose burning words sweep the whole scale of sentient being, words which in their vibration unlock the prison doors of a race, or which bind up the wounds of a suffering generation, are spoken by him who has listened, who has caught the vibrations of infinite purpose and himself become their exponent. As illustrated in the speech of the Irish patriot O'Connell, quote, "I would like to send my voice careering across the Atlantic to tell South Carolina that God's thunderbolts are hot." End quote. The same is true of those startling utterances of military generals amid the tremendous upheavals of war, or in other great emergencies of life, as in the case of Ethan Allen, with his little band of 83 men knocking at the door of the commander of the fort at Ticonderoga and demanding immediate surrender. The commander asked, "By what authority?" Allen replied, "In the name of Jehovah," and the Continental Congress. Nelson of Trafalgar, dying of a mortal wound, cried out, "Thank God, I have done my duty." And duty was henceforth the watchword of the entire army. At the Battle of Manassas, the tide of victory was turned when General Lee shouted to the army, "Look at Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." That silent attitude of Jackson was the unspoken message of courage, and he was ever after known, even in history, as Stonewall Jackson. Well might he say after such a record when dying of a mortal wound, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Madame Roland, meeting death at the hands of the French executioners, lifted her hands to the Statue of Liberty and gave as her last utterance that undying rebuke to governmental injustice. "O Liberty, what deeds are done in thy name?" Premonitions. Under the phase of mental phenomena, which, for the want of a better term, has been denominated premonitions, is found abundant illustration of our exhaustless theme of telepathy. Nor are these experiences exceptional, nor do they inhere in the lives of the more gifted. The receptive soul, in whatever strata of life, catches the prophecy of the passing vibration. In the fulfillment of that prophecy is demonstrated the fact of the listener's receptivity. Premonition is telepathic communication. Under this heading may be classified the so-called mysteries of current experience. All are reducible to the realm of the natural and the realm of mind. Law has its origin in mind. It is the offspring of mind. That law is inflexible. It is unchanged by the fluctuations of climate or temperature or of any passing event. Incidents of premonitions. A case in point of which the name is legion. In the capital of an adjacent state, it was the custom at a given hotel to call in from the surrounding country young girls to serve tables during the session of the legislature. A young lady thus employed before the close of the session married a man whom she for the first time had met at the hotel. She continued her service. The fact of her marriage was wholly unknown to her parents. On a certain morning, about 10 days subsequent to the marriage, the mother of the girl, living 20 miles away, was suddenly awakened from sleep about 3 o'clock in the morning. She aroused her husband and said to him, "Something has happened to Mary. I must go to blank on the 7 o'clock train. I wish you would get up right away and harness the team and take me into the station, 8 miles distant." The husband demurred seriously, chiding his wife for her foolish fears. She replied, "It is not fear, it is knowledge. I must go to Mary. If you do not choose to take me, I will walk to the station." She was taken to the station. She went directly to the hotel and inquired for her daughter. A half hour prior to the arrival, Mary having been missed in service in the dining room, and there being no response to the summons of the sleeping apartment of the young couple, the door was forced open. And there lay Mary and her husband, both wholly unconscious from the use of morphine. About Mary were evidences of violence. A physician was hastily summoned and was making every effort to arouse them when the mother was conducted to the sleeping room. The mother had come too late to respond to the call of Mary. Neither awakened, and both were buried in the same grave. Another case in point, which is given me today by a patient in my institute. This patient was a lady accustomed to public speaking. Hence, she was frequently called from home on unexpected summons. Her daughter usually accompanied her on these expeditions. I will let the patient tell her own story. Quote, "One morning, I awakened from sleep at the usual hour, but with the startled sense of something unusual presenting itself to my mind. I lay quietly for a few minutes, and to my mental consciousness came this picture. Daughter and I had been away on a lecturing trip. We left the train at the depot and took a carriage at the depot, as had always been our custom for the house. Arriving at the house, the driver jumped from his cab and came to the door of the carriage, when his horses gave one wild leap, whirled about, ran some distance, and overturned the carriage. The carriage was smashed into fragments, and both my daughter and myself sustained injuries. About 6 weeks later, after this mental vision, we returned home from a hastily made trip We left the train and took a carriage and came in safety to the house. The driver jumped from his cab, and as he did so, I instantly recalled a premonition of the weeks before, which until that moment had escaped my memory. I shouted at the top of my voice, "Take your horses by the bits! We can wait upon ourselves." He shouted back, "My horses are all right." I replied with more emphasis than before, "Take your horses by the bits." At that moment, he detected a sudden movement and sprang to their side. Tora and I hastily alighted. The cabman jumped to his seat. The horses became unmanageable, whirled about, ran some distance, overturned the cab, and smashed it almost into splinters. The driver was thrown to the ground and narrowly escaped injury. End quote. All the world knows the premonition which Calpurnia, the wife of Caesar, received the night before his assassination. It is a current quotation in the literature. Quote, "Beware the Ides of March." End quote. The day of Caesar's assassination. As Caesar went out to the Senate, Calpurnia, who had been entreating him all the night not to return to the Senate on that day, followed him to the door of the palace, persisting in her entreating. Caesar went to the Senate but never returned. These incidents are not exceptional. They are only cited to illustrate the truth we are endeavoring to enunciate, namely, that telepathic communication is the common experience of mankind. The so-called mysteries of life are but natural phenomena when the law of their manifestation is understood. There is another medium of expression of this power in pictorial illustrations. To one who wishes to know the current religious thought of medieval ages, the illustrated manuscripts now so carefully preserved in the museums of the world are an exponent. The time-worn frescoes of tumbling cathedrals, the defaced mosaics of scriptural themes throughout the world, still in their dismantled glory, tell the story which the artist or the painter wrought from the fires of his own soul. That soul, having heard the voice of the unknown, interpreted to men, in forms visible to the natural eye because the ear of the soul was deaf to sweet sound. These illustrated art lessons are today the silent voice of the dead centuries. But this same method of conveying truth is manifest today in the illustrated magazines and secular journals. Political campaigns are made or lost in the conveyance of thought by the pencil of the cartoonist. By these illustrations, one sees, as it were, the fiery tongues of the distant volcano, the widening chasms of rumbling earthquake, or the distant battlefield of blood, where lie the mangled forms of a nation's loved ones. Thought transference, then, is the message of the universal between man and man. Telepathy finds its highest expression in worship. Prayer is the voice of worship. Prayer is the response of the soul to the message of the infinite calling to the lost child, "Count unto me." Prayer is the channel of telepathic interchange between God and man. Ritualistic forms of prayer constitute the spent energy of voices that have died away in eternal silence. But the living voice, the appeal of the child in its helplessness to the Father in his abundance, is absolute. At the time of the Lucknow Rebellion in India, the Reverend Dr. Butler of Boston, with his wife and child, were living in the fated city. He was serving as superintendent of the Methodist mission. While the horrible holocaust of death was going on, the British authorities warned Dr. Butler to flee to the mountains with his wife and child. He resisted to the last, but the murderous sepoys were on every hand. His missionary co-workers were numbered with the slain. At the last, authorities stated to the doctor that they could no longer be responsible for his safety. They accordingly furnished him a palanquin and bearers and urged him to make the mountain passes in secret during the night to the mission station secure on the heights beyond the forest limit. He placed his wife and child hurriedly in the palanquin and walked beside it, while the bearers lifted the precious freightage to their shoulders. Advancing slowly and painfully over the ragged cliffs, about midnight they reached the density of the forest, which was the haunt of wild beasts. The night was intensely dark. The cry of the hungry beast was in their ears. They were unable to advance safe by the light of their torches. They were only protected from the wild beasts by the glimmer of these same torches. At the most dangerous point in the transit, the bearers set down the palanquin and refused to advance another step. Persuasion was exhausted. Recompense was refused. Dr. Butler himself, sole protector of his wife and child from the possible vengeance of these native bearers, or escaping this, the perils of the forest. After his return to America, to a public audience in Chicago, in giving this experience, the doctor said, "In my extremity, I stepped aside into the shadow. I fell upon my knees and asked for deliverance from him who delivered the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. I did not pray 2 minutes, but all that prayer could compass was involved in that petition. There in the shadow and the darkness, God answered. I arose from my knees, returned to the palanquin, and without my speaking a word, the bearers were relighted their half-extinguished torches, lifted the palanquin to their shoulders, and moved on through the dense forest without protest, and landed us safely at the mission house." Such is the indisputable evidence from the highest sources, from a man known to history and the church, of the possible instantaneous telepathic interchange between the human and the divine mind. Another instance to illustrate that this capacity for interchange is not measured by years or conditions. A lady whom I well know and who has been restored to health in my institute after years of helplessness gives me the following, which I quote in her own words. "I had been subject to sudden and violent attacks of what the physicians denominated collapse of the air cells of the lungs. The attacks would come upon me without the slightest warning. The struggle for breath would be extreme, and in each attack the crisis of death seemed imminent. On a certain night, I was so attacked before the hour of midnight. A physician was hastily summoned, and every effort made to control the spasm, which for 3 hours threatened my life. About 5 a.m., relief came, and I breathed again. The physician left, and my husband went to the dining room for a cup of coffee. Our little boy, then 7 years of age, had several times been a witness of these attacks and had heard the fearful whisper that his mama was going to die. On this night, he was sleeping on a lounge in the room. It was supposed his sleep was sound, for he gave no evidence of being disturbed. Shortly after my husband had gone below, he crept from the couch, went silently over to the other side of the room, and stood by the stove where he could see me. I turned my eyes toward him, and he said, in tones of perfect assurance, 'Mama, you're better, aren't you?' I answered, 'Yes, dear, but did you know that Mama was sick?' He said, 'Yes, Mama, I heard it all.' 'Then,' said I, 'tell me how you knew I was better.' He replied, with the confidence of one who had knelt before the king, and above him had been lifted the golden scepter, ''Cause I asked God to make you well, and he said he would.'" End of chapter. Telepathy and Thought-Transference by Professor S.A. Weltmer. Absent treatment. The principles involved in absent treatment depend upon a thought atmosphere which, like the invisible ether, permeates all things and all space. The movement of this atmosphere is called vibration. The primary movement is divine, is the movement of the infinite. The infinite movement never changes. The finite movement, which is another movement given to the same atmosphere by man's thoughts, is changing. When a man thinks in perfect harmony with the infinite thought on any one of these planes, he vibrates in unison with the infinite mind, and in doing so lives in compliance with law. But if the vibrations produced by the thought of man do not harmonize in the plane in which it belongs, it produces discord, which in the physical organism produces the various degrees of sickness, disease, and finally death. Thought, like all imponderable forces, is invisible, does not appeal directly to the senses. However, by assuming the proper attitude, we can admit a thought into our minds which is simple and occupying a thought plane where the moving principle vibrating in us constitutes our mental action. Man, however, can describe by constructing into form sensations produced by certain thoughts and beliefs, and thus bring into his sense consciousness the conception of this inner thought. All persons, regardless of geographical location, think exactly the same thought, occupy the same plane of thought, hence they are in a state of harmony with each other. Yet they may be out of harmony with the divine thought. If out of harmony with the divine thought, all on this thought plane are being hurled to destruction, or wasted by disease, or controlled in any of the numberless ways the laws operates upon those who violate its conditions. While, if in harmony with divine thought, regardless of distance, they are occupying the same plane just as certainly as persons living in the same altitudes of the earth are in the same physical atmosphere, regardless of location. Man is constantly, consciously or unconsciously, either living in harmony with the divine thought or out of harmony with it. Until he can consciously place himself in whatever strata or plane he chooses to occupy, he is subject to the influences of adverse thought. The directing force or the controlling influence in a human life emanating in oneself is belief. Belief is man's effort to grasp truth. Hence, that attitude of mind which conceives of the existence of the possibility makes the thing which it conceives. These are two elements in human life which inspire belief. Belief inspired by one of them puts man in a harmonious relation with the law of being. Belief inspired by the others puts him in discord with the law of being. Belief inspired by hope lifts man and holds him in harmonious relation to the vibrations of the divine thought, while fear in any of its forms always produces discord. Keeping in mind, then, that belief is the only controlling actuating impulse, that beliefs are inspired either by our hopes or fears, we have the principles involved in telepathy, also the principles involved in absent treatment. In that sense, it is that part of telepathic interchange or communion which relates to the physical man. In the physical world, thoughts relating to the body affect the body. We know disappointment and depression change and lower the rate of vibration of every soul in the physical organism. We know that hope accelerates the circulation of the blood, brings it to the surface, gives an exhilaration of spirit, lifts man into a higher thought plane, and becomes a benefit. In the religious world, thought transference has been the means always relied upon through either the spoken word or the written word. In the real Christ thought, physical application was made to transfer this thought. While the religious world have dealt more extensively with the principle involved in telepathy, they have not considered that the answer to prayer was a telepathic message as conveyed from one mind to another unconsciously, which lifted the two minds into a plane of harmony with the divine mind. But they have regarded the source to whom they pray as separate from themselves, as receiving this request made in prayer and sending it back to earth in the form of a spirit answer. They call this the answer to prayer, and the consciousness of harmony between them as the working of the Holy Spirit. This is the transcendental conception held by most of the religious people of the world. Under the light of modern thinking, which is nothing but a revival and demonstration of the Christ thought, we believe God to be everywhere present and seeking at all times to manifest the fullness of His law through His agent, man. Hence, when man is led by his hopes and can get another to hope the same thing, the two persons hoping or desiring the same thing, and if that desire would bring life and health, or whatsoever is good, these two minds are in harmony with the divine mind, and the three minds are in perfect unison. If we were to use the illustration of sound, we would say they vibrate as one sound. The Christ conception is that God is always here. Thoughts never lose their potentiality. Words have been the most universal means of embodying thought. We pick up the printed book of 10 centuries ago. We read some ludicrous incident, and we learn at once that word had in it a vitality, because it causes us to think a thought so that the risibility of our nature is excited and we are convulsed with laughter as a result. The laughter is simply the physical effect of the conception of thought transferred from the author's mind, who has been sleeping for centuries, to our minds and manifests in the physical expression of laughter. The healer is the one in a telepathic interchange who has always more or less the combination of both thought transference and telepathy. The healer, to be able to construct thought that will have a beneficent effect, must know what thoughts to think, what plane to occupy in the thought realm, and how to construct his thought into such form that it will produce, when transferred to the mind of the patient, the effect desired. It is not enough that the healer should believe in the power of thought to change physical conditions, but he must know thought does change physical conditions. Isaiah said, "So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it." From the book of Isaiah, chapter 55, verse 11. The patient, on his part, must be receptive to whatever thought the healer thinks. It is totally impossible for man, either consciously or unconsciously, to think for mankind thoughts of life, health, happiness, and the possibility of great achievement without benefiting the world. This thinking on his part will benefit the world, whether he ever expresses such thoughts or not. The influence he would exert in this way would be purely telepathic and would only reach and have an influence on others who are wholly or partly in the same plane of thought. The patient must be totally receptive to this thought. He must put his whole being in the listening attitude, in a state of expectancy inspired by hope. Conscious relation between healer and patient. The means of reaching people through this method used by successful healers is carried on through correspondence. The written suggestion sent by the healer describes the attitude of mind the patient must assume, which will put him in the proper condition to receive healthful thoughts. In doing this, the healer thinks the thought which the patient must think in order to receive the benefit he desires. Thought transference between the two. Then the thought of the healer, which has lent its eternal momentum to that particular strata of the thought atmosphere, which will vibrate through all the ages and come into the receptive mind of the patient and lift him to that plane, will sweep through his physical organism, change it with every vibration. If fears do not creep in, if discouragements are held without, it is only a question of time when the patient will manifest in his body his change of location in the thought realm. Unconscious relation between healer and the patient. There are numbers of instances where this telepathic interchange has taken place without the patient's knowledge that the healer was sending his thought. Thought is becoming more powerful as a healing agent, especially in the telepathic realm, than it has been since the days of Christ, because everyone who thinks the same thought adds an impulse to the vibrations of that plane of that atmosphere. Then, the patients who can become absolutely receptive to the thought that life, health, and happiness is their portion and is possible to them, have the added weight of this great army of thinkers who are now sending out their thoughts in harmony with the divine thought. This is being augmented by the momentum added by those who receive the thought. It was this thought Christ expressed when he prophesied he would one day rule the world, and what Paul spoke of when he said, "The time will come when no man need say to his neighbor, 'Know ye the Lord,' for all shall know him, from the least unto the greatest." At the close of this chapter, we give a number of instances where the telepathic interchange was distinctly given and distinctly received, and its effect felt by the recipient. Thinking the same thought puts the person thinking it in the strata of the mental atmosphere where he can occupy by no other means than by thinking that thought. Hence, the revival in the memory of the thoughts of one's own suffering, even though it be buried in the dead past, resurrects it again. Or rather, we sink into the grave of the past, and it takes us entirely out of the thought realm where harmony exists. This conception shows us, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. If one's thoughts relate to his body, physical conditions are the result. If they relate to his relation between man and man, a moral result ensues. If in the religious realm, then his relation to his source of being is involved. An understanding of these laws and their operation shows that no matter how man views himself, the life he receives comes of God and permeates all space. Hence, we cannot rid the smallest act or attitude of the mind of the presence of the divine. Hence, religion is the cohesive element in science. It is the cohesive element in morals. It is the cohesive element in the physical life. It is the directing force in the physical action. It is also the guiding power of the mind in decisions of judgment. By this view, we can see how religion is becoming scientific and science is becoming religious. The character of the thought that heals must be built upon absolute consciousness of a realized hope. Every attitude of mind that puts man in any degree of harmony with the divine mind is inspired by his hopes. That which causes a destructive vibration and puts him out of harmony with the divine mind is that which is inspired by his fears. Then the character of the healing thought must be one entirely born of hope. Differentiation between a thought and an idea. The new thought, having no nomenclature of its own, its exponents find it necessary to divide in thought what cannot be divided in fact, for the sake of illustration. The terms thought and idea have always been used interchangeably, while we regard them as two distinct propositions until they finally become one. It is generally conceded fact that thought is transferred from one mind to another, that the thought of the sender or thinker does not bring about a physical change, for until it has constructed into form by the mind receiving it, it has no effect physically, morally, or any other way in the mind of the recipient. I will illustrate. A thought is like a germ in the mustard seed. When planted in the ground and allowed to remain undisturbed, it, with its own latent potentiality, first attracts to itself from the surrounding moisture the elements in the soil which increase its size. Then, with the impulse supplied by the omnipotence, it sends its head upward and its rootlets downward into the soil, developing into a plant. Coming to the surface of the earth, it reaches the light and receives color. From the elements of the atmosphere, it receives hardness. It continues pushing forward, evolving into itself. The leaves, branches, flowers, and seed appear. At this time, it is a full-grown plant. It is the germ plus the plant. It was a thought at the beginning. Now it is an idea. Then thoughts would be ideas in embryo. Ideas are thoughts in their fullness. The reader will note that this germ would not have produced a plant. This thought would never become an idea had it been disturbed after being planted or been thrown to another place. The little child plants his garden, digs up the seed every day to see how it is progressing, and the result is he never gets the growth from his plant. This is the way a great many people treat their thoughts, by attitudes of doubt as to their effects, by impatience, or by any other means, all of which are introduced by the greatest enemy man has, which is his own fear. We frequently see these thoughts planted in the soil where the thought seems to develop into an idea almost instantly. Other times, we see it day by day for months and sometimes even years before the concept becomes a full-fledged percept or idea. When we speak of sending thought, the term must not be literally taken to mean we send a thought or that we receive a thought. You cannot send a thought. Thinking or believing a thing adds an impulse to that strata of the thought atmosphere in which the thought belongs. Hence, you no more send your thought than you send your force when you push a table across the floor from one end of the room to the other, because disturbing one part of this atmosphere disturbs all that strata belonging into that plane. Then the attitude of mind which should send a healing thought would be inspired by a belief, or more by a knowledge that such thoughts will heal. The patient must also assume this as a possibility. Then whatever message you can transfer to paper or words that will convey to the patient's mind a thought in harmony with the divine purpose, which is his recovery, will heal. Whoever receives and thinks such thought will be healed. Instances gleaned from actual experience. Number 1. A gentleman wrote for an absent treatment for his wife, saying she did not consider this method of healing anything but a fraud and was not willing to take treatment. However, he had great faith in it and wrote that if Professor Weltmer could treat her without her knowledge, to begin at once. We wrote the man the treatment would be given without her knowledge at 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. Later, we received a letter from the gentleman giving his statement. At 6 o'clock on the day the treatment began, he was sent for by the nurse. When he came, his wife said, "I feel very peculiar. I cannot explain it. It feels like a slight current of electricity began at my feet and ran up my body. I never felt so before." The husband, fearing the anxiety would be a detriment to her, explained that he had sent for absent treatment to be given her without her knowledge of it. She said she was content if that was the treatment, and she was able to realize it in that way, as she had no idea the absent treatment could really affect a patient. This was telepathy. From that hour, she improved. Number 2. A young lady at a neighboring town wrote for absent treatment, who had suffered a long time with painful menstruation. On the first day of the return menses, the young lady wrote me a letter describing the agony she had so long suffered, and that it was due to obstructed menstruation. It took but an hour for the transit of the letter, which reached me at 2:30. I at once sent her a telepathic message of immediate relief. On the following day, I received a letter stating that at precisely 2:30 o'clock, the previous day, she became suddenly conscious of the treatment, and at that moment the action became normal and the agony ceased. Number 3. On a given occasion, a mother in Berryville, Illinois, wrote us concerning her little daughter, Grace, who had been seriously ill for some time with chronic disease. She wrote us for absent treatment, stating at the same time she was too poor to pay for treatment, but asked if we would treat her gratuitously, as the case was urgent, and allow her to pay us at some subsequent time. We conceded to her request, and my secretary wrote definite instructions. The mother told the child a man in Nevada was treating her at 6 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock at night, so that she should get well. The child told the mother she could feel the treatment, that the treatment passed over like a shiver. In 10 days from the first treatment, the child was absolutely well, and for 3 years we received occasional letters from the mother, during all of which time the child remained thoroughly well. Number 4. The following telepathic interchange took place in our Nevada Institute recently. The professor at the head of our healing department, having under treatment a very receptive patient, agreed to the following tests of telepathic communication with the patient. Every day for 10 successive days, at the hour of 8 o'clock in the evening, each was to write in full on a slip of paper the telepathic message sent to the other, that no error be made in the recognition of the message sent. Having thus written the message, silent passivity was to be maintained, in which the written message should be mentally dispatched and the answer mentally awaited. On receipt of the answer, it was to be carefully inscribed on the paper. On the morning of each day, the messages were exchanged without a word of comment. In 6 cases out of 10, the messages both sent and received were absolutely identical, not only in thought, but in every detail of construction. Number 5. Early in our experience in the city, a businessman of immense fortune living in the city became intensely interested in our method of healing. Both he and his wife took the course of lectures and came to believe wholly in our system. Having the business interest in another city, this gentleman went thither, taking with him his wife and 2 children. They left 3 children at home. Scarlet fever broke out in Nevada, and those 3 children were each taken with the fever at about the same time. The house was quarantined. The parents, being notified of the facts, wrote me to take immediate charge of the case by absent treatment, as I could not pass the quarantine. They wrote the grandmother to call in a physician and have him prescribe for the children to comply with health regulations, but to destroy the medicine as soon as the doctor left. That Professor Weltmer would take charge of the case by absent treatment, that she should state this to the children and have them lie quiet at the fixed hour for treatment, and be certain that Professor Weltmer could cure them. As a result, no fever ran over 24 hours, and in 3 days all were well. The healer could say, "I have believed, and therefore have I spoken." The patient could say, "Of the person who healed me I know not, of the power I am totally ignorant, but this I do know, where I was sick, now I am well." Divinity answers prayers under this condition because some soul on earth has recognized that the Creator alone can restore a depletion within his own creation, and of such is the disordered body. The answer to prayer under such conditions is natural compliance with law. The suggestion of passivity for a definite period of relaxation is thought transference. Absent treatment more clearly demonstrates thought transference and telepathy in the same individual than anything else. End of chapter. Chapter 10. Practical Application. How to learn telepathy. The purpose of the foregoing chapters has been to lead the reader into a knowledge of the possibilities of telepathy and thought transference. The illustrations are simply to show what has been done. The deductions from such experiences show how, the reasoning from these deductions, and why they have been done. In answering the question, what can be done, we have dealt with facts. In the solution of the question, how can things be done, we deal with methods. In discovering why can they be done, we must understand individually and comprehensively causes. Observation discovers facts. Application. Mental or physical discovers methods. Comparison and contrast between methods discover causes. The philosophy of things is expressed in the triad: what, how, why. Until we have a degree of culture which enables man to differentiate between differences that differ, it is not so easy to determine why things can be done. Observation teaches us what is done. By studying to trust himself, this difficult problem of how is unfolded to man. If he is in doubt as to the how, he should wait, listen, and the message will come to him from somewhere. This method only deals with processes. With becoming, how is a method of demonstrating by trial, by doing things. In reading a book, the thought of the author finding lodgment in the mind of the reader does so by thought transference. The application of the lesson drawn by the reader when it finds expression is telepathy. The reader reaches his conclusions by an unknown process without the author or himself. That conclusion is telepathic. Observation alone will answer the question as to what exists and what can be done. Application by comparisons and observations, or the application of effort, the first a mental exercise, the second a physical exercise, can determine how things came to be and how things can be done. Reasoning upon relative facts and relative methods of expressing facts, one reaches the conclusion as to why things can be done. This method of differentiation is called culture. The students who undertakes to learn and put into practice the foregoing instructions in telepathy and thought transference must bear in mind the following facts. First, there is a thought atmosphere. Thought movement is called vibration. This atmosphere is intact and vibrates always the same upon the same plane, like the musical scale, the simple tones vibrating slowly and the higher tones vibrating more rapidly. The mind will vibrate in perfect unison with the plane in which it chooses to operate. These vibrations can be distinctly comprehended by those who realize such planes of vibrations exist and who learn to receive the messages. In thought transference, we see that one person can communicate with another person by means that are visible, means that are audible, means that represent temperature, fragrance, and flavor. Then again, we find there are means by which the senses can grasp thoughts which come from outside ourselves to our consciousness, thoughts which occur to us without any known medium of conveyance, which are received by the process of telepathy. The successful achievement of wireless telegraphy has demonstrated by mechanical means the existence of a thought atmosphere. It is a statement in material science that nothing produced, even in a material manner, can ever be lost. Sound, once having been produced, is said to travel on the waves of the invisible ether forever. And one can become so sensitive in assuming an utterly listening attitude that sounds which were silent for years, will come back with all the vividness of their original intonation. The attitude of the mind necessary to the student who would receive a telepathic message must be one of absolute receptivity. The second attitude is that which will, if rightly understood, enable the recipient of such message to carry it into action. This attitude is trusting. Both of these attitudes must be preceded by the attitude of mind we call belief, which is the assumption of the possibility both of receiving the message and of giving it expression. Having learned to assume the foregoing attitudes, one has at his command the ability to acquire whatever he wishes in either the field of learning or the field of individual effort. Teacher and pupil. The child who starts to school, assuming the possibility of learning to read, to write, to manipulate numbers, has taken the first step in the preparation. The second step should be to eliminate from his mind all thoughts other than those relating to the subject at hand. And the third attitude would be to trust himself to express it. And this he will do as the result of one of two attitudes the teacher will assume. If the teacher will allow the pupil to follow his own natural impulse, neither of these attitudes will be disturbed, and the result will be the child will begin, at the very inception of his school life, to work out his individuality. The second attitude of the teacher should be to encourage the child with the belief that he can learn to know and to express the lessons he is studying. Any other attitude of mind than this, which the teacher may assume toward the pupil, will thwart the pupil's progress. The value of educational training is that it qualifies the pupil to express his own thought in his own way. Thus he becomes an individual. Any system of education falling short of this is valueless. All that is required as the foundation in a young life to become a master mathematician is to assume the possibility of the mastery of the subject and refuse to allow this attitude to be disturbed. All successful achievements in individuals and in races can be traced to such determinations in youth. However, unrealized hopes very frequently lie smothered for years and do not find complete expression until in later life. Never too old to learn. Socrates mastered music in his old age. Spurgeon was 30 years learning to express gospel truths in simple language, and found when he reached that desired plane that he merely delivered message just as he received them, and at the time of their reception. This point of Spurgeon's career must not be overlooked, because it is the most important of all to the student who wishes to acquire the art of receiving and delivering telepathic messages. In the professions, lawyers, ministers, politicians, congressmen, and United States senators, notwithstanding years of college training and the reading of countless books, find themselves incapable of delivering successfully all their thoughts in public speaking without memorizing or reading from manuscript. These men have not totally ignored the law of telepathy, but they failed to recognize that they can trust their knowledge in public as they can at their private desks. He hears the telepathic message who writes his sermon and puts it on paper, but the minister has failed to apply to himself the injunction of Jesus. When you are taken before magistrates, take no thought what ye shall say. He has translated it to mean that he shall go into his own chamber, write down what he hears in secret, and read it to his congregation next Sunday, instead of going out on the housetop and delivering it direct to the people from his own soul. He puts it on paper and then puts it in a great many thoughts that were not received from the thought atmosphere, but are simply his judgment on his translation of the message. The minister who reads his sermons regularly during the year finds during a revival meeting, as is frequently the case, that some untutored member of the congregation, in a few simple words of exhortation which come into his mind at the instant of their expression, has done more to arouse interest in the religious exercises in hand than all the scholarly dissertations he has been reading to his congregation during the year. This is the case of all men in public life who have trusted themselves at the time. The minister can relieve himself from his humdrum and almost useless manner of working by thinking for 15 minutes upon the theme he wishes to discuss the next Sunday, going fishing for a week, refusing to think of what he shall say until the moment he is ready to deliver his sermon. Then trust the thought that comes to him and give it expression. If it is not more than 10 words, he will find it will be spoken to the edification of those who hear. The congressman, the lawyer, the public lecturer, and the teacher, the editor in his sanctum, the author in his study, the artist in his studio, the sculptor in his workshop, the chemist in his laboratory, the electrician, by trusting each impulse as it comes and trusting himself to express his own thoughts, will have learned in an instant how to demonstrate in his own experience that there is a thought atmosphere, that it is accessible to him who listens, and that the law of supply from omniscient wisdom is always equal and responsive, both in intelligence and power, to any demand man may make upon it. End of chapter. And also this is the end of the reading of the book titled Telepathy and Thought-Transference by Professor S.A. Weltmer. Thank you for joining me. Please do leave me a comment, hit the like button, share this with your friends, and what about those telepathic powers of yours? Let me know.